So for additional background, I want to talk about information elements, the things that are actually in our NetFlow records themselves. So if you go all the way back to NetFlow v5, this is a pattern that I think a lot of people are very used to. It was pretty dominant, and it was ultimately what introduced the technology to everyone. And this was a fixed record. So that was in the top, we have our match fields. Match fields, when you're talking about flow, are going to be the static items, the items that when these are present, this is a network conversation that we want to consider an entity. So things like source IP, destination IP, maybe the next hop IP address, ingress interface. If we're applied on ingress monitoring, it would be egress in the case we're applied on egress monitoring. The ports and protocol, and that will ultimately define what our flow is. And then while that flow is open and active in the flow cache, all of our collect fields will actually be determined while the conversation is ongoing. So things like packet delta count, byte delta count are kind of the obvious ones, but TCP flag aggregate, so all of the TCP flags that were observed during that period of time, TOS bits, kind of information that needs to be decided by the device as it's going through or observed over a period of time, as we saw with the timers in the previous one. Like if we think about TCP flags, the initial SYN is going to come off the client, an ACK will come back, or SYN ACK will come back from the server, an ACK from the client. That all happens in the first minute because it's going to happen very quickly. You get a TCP aggregate of those three flags. Ultimately, with our minute by minute quantization of the flow, if some sort of reset starts happening, TCP red starts getting involved, something weird's going on, we actually have that minute by minute granularity in order to figure out when those things are occurring, as opposed to just looking at an overall aggregate and saying it did happen, but it's difficult to attribute exactly what time slice those events occurred in. So in this case, again, NetFlow v5, static records, pretty limited in what it can actually export. Good information, but still there isn't really any user level control over it. This was kind of the early approach to NetFlow because it was very easy. You could expect the same input from every device, and there was some uniformity by what you could actually expect to be receiving, and not a lot of variability in what the actual information elements, the fields of the NetFlow record could contain. As time moved on, we had NetFlow v9 and then ultimately IPFIX, which is NetFlow version 10. But once we move into these newer versions of flow data, we start getting into templated flow data. So this is something term, if you're very familiar with flow, you'll know for sure. If you're peripheral to flow, you may have heard. But templating flow data allows these records to be variable and have different types of information in them and in different combinations, and ultimately vendor specific items too. So things that maybe weren't even considered, when NetFlow was initially proposed, but the technology moved along later down the road, and suddenly we can, use DPI techniques to give an application label to a flow record, and we need an information element to actually store the label for that application in. So with IPFIX, we get this idea of templated flow structures, and then ultimately platforms like the Plixer platform can read in these templates, understand what that device is telling us, and then ultimately at a very high rate parse the data records as they come in, because we don't need all the overhead of the fields defining what the data is. If you think about something like JSON has a field identifier on every value. So when you transport that data, it's automatically significantly larger than it needs to be, just because if we already know what the fields are, then we can just parse that kind of in order against the template and then label those values as they're supposed to be as the template defines. Kind of without that structure, again, you really need those field identifiers over and over and over again. And then ultimately we're in the business of solving, kind of the million flows a second situation where every byte counts. So compressing this input data down and still being able to have a really verbose catalog of elements that you can report on really becomes kind of the main problem of solving, and really what powers the ability to do quick root cause analysis and have really low level granular access to really interesting elements and attributes of your flow that necessarily wouldn't be represented in something like a V5 record. So this is a major part of the platform and a major part of helping use the capabilities that all of our exporting devices, the actual network infrastructure itself, can enrich flow data with. Again, things like usernames. If you're terminating a VPN, you want to actually attribute those flows to a person or a device that can do DPI and tell you exactly what application it's classified as, all the way through things like performance-based metrics. Anyone that joined us for the last webinar, that was what that was all about, was like UDP jitter, kind of figuring out the variance in inter-arrival time between packets. That ultimately needs an information element to deliver those millisecond readings into the platform, and then TCP latency, kind of the same idea. You need some sort of field in the flow record that knows that's a millisecond value and has some understanding of kind of what the quality of the metric actually is. So a platform understanding those information elements and ultimately making them available through reporting and API calls in context of what they actually are meant to represent goes a long way in kind of short-circuiting the troubleshooting workflow by just, again, leveraging what these devices can already do.